It's a short war. It's not like a biggie. It's not something that comes up. I think probably right. It's not something. It's not like a top. It's not one of the top
No,
wars.
no, no. But
So,
it's notable. It's notable for several reasons, though.
but I think
It,
the more like looking at the slides and the research that you did, it's really it's as relevant as ever. I think, and it's so interesting. So I think when we look at the future, I think we need to look back. We need to look to the past. Chuck has always said that. You don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. So this is another great example of finding out where we've been, finding out what we've done. Um, as a country, we've made a lot of mistakes, and there are some heroes out there though. So let's dive in. Chuck, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
okay.
Thanks for
Thanks,
being here
Michelle.
today, always. I'm gonna put
Of
you
course.
on pin. Hold on, let me just get you pin there. What is going on with me today? Where are my participants? There you are. I'm just pinning you or spotlighting you so that they see you in their screen, little screen, and then I'm going to pull up the presentation, which is right here. Okay, there we are. That's not the beginning. There's the beginning. I'm going to start it from the beginning. Okay, there we go. If you folks want to just keep yourselves muted until we're done, and then we will open it up for questions as we always do. All right, thanks everybody. Chuck, take it away.
Okay. Here we go. Thanks, Michelle. And welcome to today's presentation on the Native American U.S. Army conflict referred to as the Modoc War. This took place in Northern California and extreme Southern Oregon in the years 1872 carrying over to the middle of 1873, a grand total of 8 months of conflict. But there's plenty behind the scenes. There's years of conflict that lead up to this particular war that we'll cover today. And we will meet some, as Michelle said, some scoundrels and heroes, as we always do. I tried to seek out some of the more unrenowned folks to highlight and talk about a little bit. So we will follow that tradition today, and we begin with a map. The next slide will show a map of the area. This is kind of a larger overview. The red dot doesn't mean anything because we're going to be inland from the coast on your map, probably about 100 miles, even a little bit more as the crow flies from the coast of Oregon and California. So we're in a very, very north central, northeast California. Here's a closer look of what we're talking about. You can see even today, the Interstate I-5 runs far, far to the west of this location. So even today, this remains a very remote, under-visited area. And back in the day, this was not the part of California and Oregon that was focused on for gold. Gold had been found, of course, in the 1840s in California, and gold strikes were continuing throughout the West, but this area did not produce very much gold at all. So it was not considered a hot spot by gold seekers and fortune hunters, but it was considered excellent ranching land, grazing country. This is a intermountain area. It's called part of the Great Basin of the West. So you're surrounded and ringed by mountain ranges, but you're pretty much in a very high desert environment, which we'll see from the photographs today. Very, very harsh, relatively inhospitable. Even today, it's very lightly populated, but we will get to see a little closer look at what this area looked like and still pretty much looks like today. So we go to the next slide and we meet one of the very first superintendents of Indian Affairs in the state of Oregon, a brand new state, actually. In fact, in 1850, it wasn't quite yet a state. It was a territory. But this man came in, Hansen Dart, and he had a very formidable task of traveling through the state, or what became the state, and securing signatures on multiple treaties that he made with multiple tribes. And again, as with most native U.S. Authorized treaties, um, it's very unlikely that the natives knew exactly what they were signing. Interpreters were far and few between at this point. So Dart did his best and managed to come up with 16 treaties and a recommendation or two for the Interior Department, where his treaty recommendations were all shelved. Apparently, he did not have full authorization to do these treaties, and it got lost in the Senate shuffle and eventually fell away. Now, it's not to say that had these treaties passed, there would have been no warfare in the area. That's naive to say. However, Dart did undertake his proceedings with good intent, and it left a bitter taste in his mouth, and for sure it just delayed conflict to future commissioners. By the mid 1850s, most of the west coast of Oregon was very much in conflict. They're known today as the Rogue River Wars. They took place throughout southwest Oregon, not into the area we're talking about today, further to the west. But again, these are examples of conflicts that could have been mitigated had Dart gotten his treaties approved in the Senate. So again, we see a series of attempts by the government to get treaty concessions from natives. And then we see the other side of the Caucasian response to the growing interest in the area. And we meet our next participant in today's Zoom chat. His name is, next slide, please, Captain Benjamin Wright. The hat indicates his Quaker status. He grew up on the East Coast, moved west, and became very, very notorious for his proclivity to attack natives, provoked or unprovoked. And the particular attack in question for today took place in 1852. And this was a response by Captain Wright, who was a militia member, lived a little bit south of the lava beds in Northern California. And he responded to a native attack on a settler train, a wagon train, by going into the Modoc country and slaughtering approximately 40 Modoc members, including the next slide's dad. So we'll get our first introduction here to a star of the show today. It's Captain Jack. That was the white name for him. His native name was Kintpuash. We see him posing in 1870 in a California studio. This is pre-war. But again, Captain Jack was a young man in 1852, probably in his early teens, when he witnessed his father and several family members slaughtered at the site of the Ben Wright massacre. And again, put him into a wary and very cautious mode when it came to dealing with the whites. Now, to his credit, he was not a dedicated warrior in the sense of he would counsel his fellow tribal members to stay away from revenge attacks and unwarranted attacks. He had a lot of patience and became a tribal leader at a very young age, and tended towards the peaceful solution rather than the violent solution, although we will see contrast to that later, again, when he was pushed to the wall. But once again, we meet Captain Jack here, and he figures prominently in the rest of the story. But this is his first introduction to the new regime coming in, the ranchers and the military. We go on to another native agent. This man's name, Lindsay Applegate, part of a very prominent pioneer family in the state of Oregon, came in the 1840s with brothers, created a trail, which today is still known as the Applegate Trail. And was actually a very reasonable man when it came to Native American relations. The Modocs were happy that he was appointed a agent, and this is approximately in the 1863 period, 1864. And again, during this period, of course, Oregon had become a state in the late 1850s, and the nation was embroiled in, of course, the Civil War. So Native affairs didn't take a top priority during this time for the Lincoln administration, as one could imagine. But Applegate saw a chance in 1864 to not only listen to the Modoc, but try to get their ideas put into play. And one of the Modoc's main complaints, which started right around this time, was the solution by most whites at the time was to force the Modocs, which were fairly small in number. This isn't a large tribe. We're talking into the maybe several hundred, 300 to 500 range. And they weren't considered large enough for their own reservation, although Captain Jack and others had requested this. And they not only requested a reservation, they requested a reservation away from their traditional native enemies, which happened to be the Klamath tribe. Applegate understood this, and when the Modocs requested a separate reservation, Applegate put in the request and was denied. So the agreement, which comes after several attempts to voluntarily have the Modocs relocate from their Lost River area in Northern California to the existing Klamath Reservation in Southern Oregon, about 40 miles away, but far enough from their homeland that they did not like the new accommodations. The Modocs also did not like being on the same reservation with their traditional enemies, the Klamath. So Applegate's attempts failed, and it just shows another example of ways that the impending war could have been avoided with simple decisions, with subdividing the existing reservation, or at least providing more protection from the Klamath. The Modocs were traditionally ruled over by the more aggressive Klamath, and even when they started settling on the reservation, one of the several attempts, they would start building houses, have the lumber stolen, and eventually Captain Jack led his band of Modocs several times off the reservation. Now, to explain also, the Modocs had a split around this time. One of the older tribal leaders, his name was Old Sconch, and he believed that the Modocs should accept the deal and stay with the Klamaths and deal with the difficult situation, whereas the younger folks, including Captain Jack, found it impossible to deal with the Klamaths. So they continuously would go back to their home country at the Lost River and continuously heard complaints from settlers. The settlers would contact their politicians, they would contact the military. So the pressure was mounting on the military to come up with a more permanent solution as opposed to this back and forth action by the Modocs. So we move ahead to the next commissioner of this situation, a man by the name of Alfred Meum. And he is well worth remembering as a staunch defender of the Modocs, put into a position of commissioner. Now, what makes him interesting is he comes in around 1869. He is an Oregon resident at this time. He's a Methodist minister, and this signifies a change in Native American policy from the warfare-based policy to a peaceful, more religious-based policy. Now, coming from the U.S. government, one would think perhaps a problem with church and state violations, but the newly elected president, General Ulysses Grant, had a strong desire to focus on appointing religious men and religious leaders into these positions of negotiators, simply trying to convince the natives to peacefully submit to their designated spots or reservations. Now, Meum, again, like Applegate, took a more detailed interest in the Modocs' plight and personally came up with a solution that I had mentioned briefly. His idea was, again, he could not authorize a separate reservation for Captain Jack and his band of Modocs. That was not within his realm. His boss at the Department of the Interior could have, but the folks in Washington had no interest in caving to native requests at this time. However, Meacham found a very, very potentially good solution when he suggested that a separate camp or separate basic military base be set up at the very southern end of the Klamath Reservation. So it would technically be part of an existing reservation, but it would be separated by military, by geography, and it would be controllable to the point where the Modocs would have peace and a relative continuation of their way of life. They would have had more access to terrain more similar to what they were used to, and it just would be a more pleasing result for the Modocs. So Meacham attempted and failed at this suggestion, which leads us to believe that really his latitude was very, very, very small. He did not have a lot of leeway to really work with the natives and negotiate. He was pretty much forced into his superiors' decisions. In fact, there's admission from the Department of the Interior that his suggestions were ignored, like purposefully ignored, which again could have saved everyone involved some time and trouble. We'll meet Alfred again here as we get into the uglier aspects of the story. But again, right now, this is 1869, 1870, tensions mounting. We have the Modocs returning repeatedly to their homeland and increasingly agitating the settlers, not by anything particular, simply by their presence there. So finally, Grant decides to send military to force the Modocs onto the reservation. This is 1872, and it doesn't go very well. They asked the Modocs to disarm themselves. There were about 50 warriors in the camp, and probably another 100 or so women and children and elders. So the military went in, demanded the guns be put down. There was some resistance. Gunshots went off. 2 men were killed, 1 on each side, and the Modocs retreated to the area known as the lava beds, which we will be introducing you to very shortly. The lava beds in this area were literally, rock that was formed from volcanic lava, extremely coarse rock, a pumicey rock that would tear up shoes and tear up gloves, and really was hard to traverse. A cave system existed under these lava beds that the natives knew about, of course, and the retreat took place in 2 columns. Captain Jack took a column in from one side, and the second column was led by a native by the name of Hooker Jim. I've seen it also as Hookah Jim. And Jim was younger and far more violent and far more angry than Captain Jack. So on his way to the lava beds, Hookah Jim personally slaughtered 18 civilians at various ranches on the route. He selected only the men of the family, leaving behind very, very frightened and very upset and very angry settlers. And this became the first focus of the military in this campaign. It was to get the guys or the person who slaughtered all of these innocent people. That was the main focus. And again, we see the tension at a high point, and the military is starting to have to ramp up activity because the natives are now entrenched and they're not going anywhere. And we'll see the difficulties the military face shortly. But we're going to meet a man next who is very, very integral to our Zoom experience today. He was a very, very early photographer. His name is Edward Muybridge, born Edward Muggeridge. He changed his name to the original spelling of Edward after a very serious head injury that took place in a stagecoach accident in California when he was in his 20s. This man emigrated to the US from England at about age 20. On his return to England is when he had the head injury, and he had to recoup and spend some time in England. When he returned to the United States, he had become a changed person. People who knew him didn't recognize him, didn't recognize his habits, his demeanor, and he also became somewhat of a genius when it came to photography. He immersed himself in photography and was selected by the U.S. military to photograph war of 1872. So this is a very unique event in that it's a very, very well documented war from a period where these native conflicts did not get documented or rarely were documented in such detail. So we have not only the photographs have survived, but the wood gravings that were used by newspapers who took the photographs and transferred them to a wood engraving, because early newspapers could not print photographs until a little bit later. So we have a combination of very artistic wood engravings based on his photography, and we have the photographs themselves. And admittedly, we have a whole lot more to talk about with Muybridge. We're probably going to do a whole segment on him because he goes on to later fame. But at the time, he was really considered an innovator, and few people probably could have succeeded in what he was doing, given the rugged conditions, given the fact that he had to bring his dark room with him on wheels. He called it the Helios Flying Laboratory, and he literally brought it to these spots in the lava beds to take the photographs we're going to see. One thing to note, though, is he admits later that several of the photographs were staged. He used Native American Modocs to pose as Modocs for certain photographs, and I'll try to point those out as we come across them. But anyway, very important figure documenting the war here, Mr. Muybridge. We go forward now. We're going to introduce you to the lava beds. Today, this area is a national monument, as you can see. I have visited this national monument on at least 3 occasions, and it always amazes me every time I go, just the sheer immenseness of it, the sheer remoteness of it, and the ruggedness. There's hardly a tree to be found for 50 miles around. And again, you have these temperature controlled caves that are extremely explorable. They are partially open to the public, and it gets little use because of its remoteness. It literally is one of the hardest national monuments to get to. And again, the native name for the lava beds you can see listed there, Katai Tala. And that language that I just spoke is, do I have that down here? Yes, that would be called, well, I'll come across it in a little while. They have a name for their language. Anyway, the lava beds provided ultimate protection for the 50 warriors. Again, remember that number. 50 Modocs are the fighting force for this war. It's not that the women and children aren't helping, but the actual fighting force is 50, and they have single action rifles. No bump stocks on these. It's a one shot, and you got to reload it. So they had no technical advantage whatsoever outside of these lava beds, which, of course, it's not a technical thing, it's a natural thing, but the Army increasingly found it beyond challenging to route these Modocs out of the caves, and it became kind of a standoff with ambushes along the way where the Modocs would appear and take out 20, 30 soldiers with 0 losses. They were doing this almost in complete cover, and it got increasingly frustrating for the military. They realized it was becoming a losing battle. So we go to the next slide. I believe it's another image from the lava beds, if I'm not mistaken. Oh no, We have the two on the one slide. Okay, here is a very important person in the story as well. This is Captain Jack's cousin. Her native name is Weima, but that's not her birth name. I don't have her birth name handy right now, but I do know that it translated to strange child. And the reason she was given that name is she was born with reddish colored hair, which was considered unusual. So as Toby grows up, she was born in the 1840s, similar age to Jack, I believe. As she grows up, she's a young teenager at this point when she gets her next name, Wynema, which means woman chief. She earns this name by saving a canoe full of younger children from rapids in a nearby river. She saves the canoe from certain upset and destruction by steering it to safety. So she becomes kind of a tribal hero. And then she becomes a tribal rebel by meeting and marrying Mr. Frank Riddle. And I don't think that's Frank in the picture to the left there, but we do have another picture of Frank coming up. He was a gold miner from Kentucky who stumbled into this area and met and fell in love with Wynema, much to the regret of her family, until Mr. Riddle followed Modoc tradition by giving her dad several horses. Her family wanted nothing to do with them, but after that gesture, they reciprocated with gifts, and Frank became a welcome and important member of the Riddle family. Toby and Frank would go on to have a son by the name of Jefferson, and he continued his tribal leadership into the future. But more importantly, the Riddles became the main interpreters for negotiations between the U.S. military and the Modocs. You had an expert, of course, native Modoc speaker, and a woman who also quite ably learned English from her husband. And you had the reverse with Frank, who was an expert English speaker who also picked up Modoc language quite well. So you had a two-headed team, very, very esteemed on both sides for the most part. Some Modocs looked at Toby as a potential traitor. Some Modocs did not trust her as a go-between between Captain Jack and the military brass, but generally she had the trust of all sides because she simply wanted to help get to some sort of peaceful negotiation. She was not a warrior, not from a warrior clan. She really had peace on the mind, and we'll see where that leads her down the road. But for now, we go to the next slide and we meet the main military brass here in this location for this story. This is General Edward Canby. He didn't really go by the name Edward. He went by other names such as Richard or his initials, but he was a very, very competent administrative type, not as competent perhaps in the battlefield area. But again, he was well respected. He was considered fair, and he was not considered, again, he wasn't considered very pro-war. He wasn't the type that was going to be trying to stir up trouble. He believed in the peaceful operations, and he was appointed actually to a peace commission. This is after, again, 3-4 months of war. It starts in November. It's going through the winter. The military is faring very poorly. They're losing every battle, like with multiple casualties, with natives having 0 casualties. So it's almost like getting kind of lopsided, and the frustration level increases. So Canby is appointed by President Grant to a peace commission to actually come to some sort of final decision, some sort of ultimatum without the use of force. And this is where Canby is put as we go into the spring of 1873. Wynema is a main negotiator between the general and Captain Jack. Unfortunately, we have a breakdown on both sides. One of the problems with General Canby and his staff is that they were not authorized to go off the script and work with Jack on a different reservation plan. There was no other plan. It was basically You're going to have to get these Modoc onto the Klamath Reservation. End of story. And Canby was going to stick to that line no matter what. So it was increasingly frustrating. There were peace conferences canceled because Jack seemed to know it wasn't going to go anywhere. But finally, Jack and Canby agree to another meeting with the peace commissioners. There's a commission of about 5. Mr. Meum is on that commission, along with a different a religious man, a reverend affiliated with a different church, and 2 local respected men also appointed to the staff. And as the weeks are leading up to April, when this next meeting is planned, Weima, in her activities as a go-between, hears increasing talk of an ambush planned against the general and his commissioners. She warns Meum. Meum had become a friend of hers. She warned Meum. He said, well, we still have to do our job, or something like that. She warns Canby, and Canby says, well, it doesn't look good if the general doesn't show up because he's afraid, so I'm not going to not go. But again, he refused to carry a sidearm. He went unarmed to this peace commission. And on the day of the set meeting, which was to take place on April 11th, 1873, on the actual day, Weima heard even more solid evidence that this was going to happen. It was the ambush was a go. So she physically goes to the military camp and literally tackles Meum in his attempt to go to the peace commission. She says, you cannot go, they're going to get you. And she tries to physically stop him from going. Canby was already going. He didn't heed the warning. He appreciated the sentiment, but he said, no, we have a job to do. So both men ignored a very, very clear and serious warning by the interpreter. And not surprisingly, there's another group photo here we'll see before the fateful day. But this next photo is a picture of Frank Riddle and Toby. Frank would be on the far upper right with the beard. Toby's in the upper middle, and that is on the far left, the tall gentleman. That is Oliver Applegate, part of the military commission, not part of the peace commission. He's just part of the military team. And then we see several natives in the foreground. I have a quote from Mr. Applegate. This came in, I think, 30 years after the war, but it's still relevant today because Oliver had to deal with Weima on a regular basis. And he said, quote, she was courageous and intelligent, and had her counsel been taken, the bloody Peace Commission massacre would not have occurred. And he said that about 30 years after the fact. So again, it was acknowledged that she was trying her best to prevent the setup to the massacre. And we go to the next slide, and we'll see a depiction of that moment. It happened on Good Friday, of all days, 1873, April 11th. And the peace conference didn't really start well. Captain Jack was there, and he was actually pushed into the murder plot. Again, a peaceful man, did not approve of the plot. He was actually hounded into accepting the plot. And one of the techniques that his fellow warriors used to pressure him was they forced him to wear women's clothing in these council meetings to try to shame him into being a man and to doing what manly men do, and that's kill people who are unarmed or whatever. So he's pushed into this against his will. But when he's at this meeting, he has a very simple request of General Canby, and it's, we're not going to the reservation. We're not going to live with the Klamath. He says, why not just give us the lava beds? This is a very simple proposal. This is a very reasonable proposal in the sense of the lava beds had zero interest for any settler, for any military operations, zero. There was no gold, no other minerals, nowhere to farm, nowhere to graze, nothing. You couldn't build there. You couldn't take the lava out. It was literally a wasteland to every single white person of interest. So, and it wasn't ideal for the natives either. They couldn't live simply in the lava beds. They would still have to have access to some areas around them for things that didn't happen in the lava beds, like food, like growing food, wild plants, very far and few between. Anyway, when Captain Jack heard Canby say, that is not in my area of authorization, I cannot authorize that, and I'm going to ignore it and just continue to talk about the Klamath Reservation. When he did that, that was it. Captain Jack said, okay, let's go. And so this triggered natives coming out of the woodwork. They were hiding, they were ducking behind bushes, they were armed. 2 men were killed, including the only general killed in the Indian Wars of the period. This is it, Edward Canby. The other minister was killed, Eleazar Thomas, and Meacham was wounded severely during this event, and he was laying on the ground, and he was about to be scalped by a native we'll meet in a little while, Shak Nasty Jim. And Weima comes across this scene, and this is her friend, Meacham, on the ground, not dead, but injured and about to be scalped. She comes along and says, look, the troops are coming. Distracts them enough, they run. There were no troops coming, they were already there. So she gets the focus away from Meacham. Meacham is able to get up, and she helps him away and treats his wounds and basically saves his life. There's no doubt about that. So we have the aftermath now of the Canby murder, and I'm going to read you a quote that came out of a newspaper in the South. Now, let me remind you that this murder turned the press away from the Modoc cause. The Modocs were getting fairly favorable press at this time. People were kind of on their side, except for the Hooker Jim incident with the slaughtering of the settlers, of the locals there. No one approved of that, but at the same time, they were getting positive reviews because it was such a heavily covered war in the media until the Canby assassination. And after that, it got vehement against the Modocs. They were calling for immediate execution. They were calling for skipping any kind of tribunals or trials. We just have to execute these people immediately. But one Georgia newspaper had something nice to say about the murder of General Canby. The headline said, Captain Jack and warriors revenge the South by murdering General Canby, one of her greatest oppressors. So we have a unique view coming from the former Confederacy. However, most of the country is ready to get over the Modocs and put them out of commission. So we go to the next slide, and we will see the person to replace General Canby in this military operation. His name, interestingly, Brigadier General Jefferson Columbus Davis. Okay, little backstory on him. Civil War veteran who I'm sure was harassed about his name. This would be like a Confederate general named Abraham Lincoln. This was a problem, I believe, in his social life and his communication efforts. And while stationed in Kentucky, he was approached by a senior officer, a general by the name of Bull Nelson, and he was insulted by him. He didn't get information that he was hoping to get from Davis, and he belittled him, and Davis demanded an apology, and it didn't happen. So I think a day or two later, Davis returns to the hotel and is insulted. Again, he's called a little puppy this time by Nelson, who's 6'2" and 300 pounds. Davis gets a gun from his friend and shoots Nelson in the heart, murdering his superior officer, an event that got no repercussion. There was no military tribunal here. There was no court martial, nothing. The military simply overlooked it as a justified homicide because they needed experienced officers, and Davis, of course, was one of them. So Davis basically got away with murder and went on his Civil War campaign, but never could get full promotions because of this quiet black stain on his record. But anyway, he shows up in the lava beds, and it's a big relief to the military, which is now numbering about 1,000 personnel. You had 400 at first, and another 500 show up, and of course the numbers fluctuate because the volunteers went home at some point. But literally, there's roughly 1,000 soldiers now focusing on the lava beds, coming in, circling, looking for avenues to get in. And now they're bringing in heavy artillery like howitzers and such to try to blast the natives out. So again, Jefferson comes in and it renews the Army's spirit to finish the job. And we see from there things start to turn for the U.S. Army. They have some successful attacks. In one location in particular, they had a hard time with, and we'll see on the next slide. This was the mainstay of Captain Jack's protection cave. This is called the Captain Jack Stronghold. And literally, this was the center of the lava beds. And Captain Jack had a strong network of people who can fetch water and obtain food. So they were pretty comfy in there. Babies were born during this period in there, and this starts to change after the death of Canby. Upon retreating to the lava beds, shortly thereafter, within weeks, you had a very much intensified U.S. bombardment of the stronghold. So eventually, this was sometime in May, they drive out the Modoc warriors, again, 50 or so warriors and approximately 150 additional men, women, and children. They sneak out in the middle of the night out of some back exit of the lava bed. So the military continues to bombard, not knowing they were bombarding an empty cave complex until someone realized, okay, they saw a trail going out. They know the natives have not only left the area, they've split up. So now they're in several smaller bands, hiding various parts around the area. So we go to the next slide, and we'll see another view in the lava bed area. This, I believe, is the slide, I believe, was published in Harpers Weekly. And again, we had all of the major magazines and newspapers covering this extensively. And we see one of the camps off on the right with their native style tents, which is interesting. These were developed during the Civil War based on native styles. And I believe they were called Sibley tents. And on the left, you can see the cover of the Harpers Weekly, and this would be early summer 1873. So again, it's getting a lot of press attention. The pressure on the military to execute is intensifying, but you also had voices that were trying to modify some of the more screechy anti-native talk, and we'll meet a couple of those folks coming up. But again, we'll go to the next slide and see another magazine cover. This is from a magazine called Frank Leslie's Illustrated. And this literally shows the escape that I just mentioned. This happened, I believe it was May. This is May of 1873. And this is supposed to be under the cover of dark. And you see a line of people exiting stage left. And again, left the military kind of holding the bag. They were a bit embarrassed. We let them get away, but they weren't going very far. They were starting to show signs of weariness of being on the run and not being fully supplied. So because the bands broke up, the Modocs broke into different groups. The one group was led by Hooker Jim. And if you remember, Hooker Jim was the one responsible for the most heinous of the attacks on the settlers. And Hooker Jim, though, realized at some point, I might be able to save my butt if I can turn in everybody else, if I can lead the military to Captain Jack and the other ringleaders. And this is what he did. He became turncoat, and he received clemency for his actions in leading the military to Captain Jack and family. So sure enough, it took until early June, but they do find Captain Jack, and they bring him in. His only quote at that time, Captain Jack's, was, "My legs gave out." So that was his reasoning for submitting to being charged with war crimes. And this becomes a very, very curious thing to me, because when I saw that this was the only time Native Americans were ever charged with war crimes by the US military, the first thing that came to my mind was, I didn't know there were war crime statutes in the 1870s. Who wrote them? Where did they come from? And why was the military adhering to them? We have notoriously, as a country, up until the present day, kind of looked the other way at international tribunals and international courts and war crime issues. We kind of selectively have enforced that while violating it ourselves from time to time. So this was a surprise to see that they weren't simply charged with murder; they were charged with war crimes, which again is a bit baffling and a bit startling to me. It probably doesn't change the results. They were going to try to get them hanged no matter what the charge was. So this probably just guarantees a more serious charge would be applied upon the finding of guilt. So we move to the next slide, and we're going to meet some of the natives involved. So this is after the capture. These pictures were all taken not by Muybridge. Muybridge had moved on by this time. We had another photographer in the mix, but again, these are all very, very well documented photos. This is Scarface Charlie, and this is a photo taken, I believe, after the war period. Because his clothes do not match the clothes he was assigned as a POW. But again, he was one of the bolder, one of the more aggressive warriors, and was again fighting for his life, and it cost him his life. But again, one of the faces of the war. We'll meet another one next. This is the picture of both Captain Jack and his older companion, Sconchin John, and that's the next slide. You can see Mr. Sconchin John is on the left. He is the older gentleman. Captain Jack is on the right. And Sconchin had a brother who was called Old Sconchin, and he became the leader of the Klamath Reservation Modocs. In other words, when they first split years earlier, Old Sconchin said something like, "I will never go after the white man again until that mountain falls." And he pointed to a distant mountain, which is still there. So he had pledged peace, where his brother chose the home country of the Lost River. He couldn't hack the Klamath combined reservation experience. So he became one of the more vocal and experienced elders in this brief war. So again, he would be one of the 4 sentenced to die in this court martial. I'm sorry, in this military tribunal. And we move on to the next slide, and we meet Shak Nasty Jim. This is another photo taken, I believe, after the war had ended. These are very, very nice photos, by the way. I haven't seen these, but Shak Nasty Jim is significant because he was the one who was taking Alfred Meum's, I believe he was taking some of his effects, and another man was about to scalp him when Weima stepped in and saved his life. So Shak Nasty was involved in that. But more importantly, Shak Nasty Jim was not charged as one of the 6 perpetrators. So he was eventually shipped to Oklahoma with the remainder of the tribe, where he had a family who had a family. And today, one of the main links to the Modoc tribe is through his great-granddaughter, and her name is Chiwa James. So when we get to the end, we'll talk about some documentaries. It's basically Chiwa James who is responsible for a lot of our current Native American views regarding the Modoc War. So an important figure here, looking great in the suit. And our next slide will show the most nasty of all, not Shak Nasty, it's Hooker Jim. This guy looks like just the personification of vengeance in this photograph to me. He looks like he could be from a modern gang from wherever, ready to start some mayhem. And again, both troubling because of his unwarranted attack on innocent settlers. And his other unsettling nature is his turning in of his fellow farrier Captain Jack simply to get clemency. It was a saving his butt moment for sure, and he succeeded. And that's the legacy with Hooker Jim. So, but now we're going to meet a politician from the state of California. He represented California's 3rd district at this time. He was a Republican, and his name was John K. Latrell. And we see him sitting in the chair, looking very stately with a wonderful mustache. And I'm going to read you a quote from Mr. Latrell that I think is a great example of the often overlooked view of certain few white men who actually understood what was going on here. I mean, this man was elected by some of the people who were victims in this attack. And here's what he still said, quote, "This is in a letter to the Secretary of the Interior, whose name was Columbus Delano." Yes, that is Franklin Delano's relative, Mr. Roosevelt's relative, but I'm not sure exactly how direct, but definitely a relation. But here's what Latrell said to Delano, quote, "The war was caused by the wrongful acts of bad white men," end quote. Another quote in the same letter, "There never was a time since the organization of our government that there was so much corruption and swindling as is today practiced on the Indian reservations on this coast," end quote. It's important to also note that John K. Latrell did not win a seat for re-election for a 4th term. He served only 3 terms, 6 years, and went back to private activities. But again, notable today because there weren't many voices like Mr. Latrell's at a time post Canby murder, because pretty much even folks who had supported Modocs, as I had mentioned, were now backtracking and in favor of execution. So we go through this pretty much a sham trial. It was pretty much predetermined what was going to happen. It took about a month to complete. But what's very interesting about the trial to me is that only recently, so we're talking about in the last 10 years or so, diaries have surfaced in Klamath County, Oregon, and have been turned into historians and libraries that show heavily documented interviews with the doomed natives in the weeks leading up to their hanging. And to me, it does show another side of the story. Again, I always like to remind people that as dead as we think history is, it really never is dead as long as new information comes to light that is valid, that buttresses or enhances or corrects or fills out a story. And that's what we see here. We see new information coming to light, and we see, again, thankfully, the native story being told a little more loudly and a little more proudly than a lot of the early histories showed. So again, we are going to show the next slide. This is the result, basically, of the decision. So there were 6 men sentenced to die. 4 were hanged, including Captain Jack and Sconchin John. 2 of them were had their sentences commuted by President Ulysses Grant to life sentences in Alcatraz, of course, the famous prison off the California coast. One of those men died shortly thereafter. The other one was pardoned. I believe it was about 5 years later. So we see one guy got away, 4 were hanged, 1 died, and the rest were shipped as prisoners of war to Oklahoma Territory, which was then called Indian Territory. 1873, they show up. They're thrown in with the Shawnee tribe, I believe, and at least they're not mortal, bitter ancestral enemies like the Klamath. So the Modocs do okay. They of course lost their home country and lost a lot of tradition, but managed to keep some things together. And then in the early 1900s, after Oklahoma becomes a state, they were offered, all of these Modocs who were alive and their descendants were offered a chance to return to Oregon, expenses paid, to resettle on the Klamath, the now expanded Klamath Reservation. And 30 or so do choose to do so. So there's basically today two recognized bands of Modocs in the United States, one in Oklahoma, one in Oregon. But the Oregon Modocs have a separation. And the separation is basically the ones who never left the reservation, going back to the 1860s, the ones who accepted living with Klamath and stayed there and prospered and bred and basically became almost more of the Klamath tribe as well. The returnees who go back to Oregon have a more separate life because they've been disconnected from a lot of their Modoc relatives. Not that there's tension or animosity necessarily, it's simply that they're a separate band with separate now traditions, some brought back from Oklahoma even. But again, it's the remnants of a never large band kind of banding together to create a stronger whole. And I think we do see that today. The Modocs are well represented in tribal councils. They've tried to reclaim the of looking at this war in a different light, looking at the war as a challenge for Native Americans to find a way to transition to the future without giving up all of their past, without giving up all of their heritage and their beliefs. And I think that we can see in the Modocs a very tenacious and a very persistent group who are very, very proud of their heritage to this day. We are going to go a little further. There's a little bit more to share with you. The first thing I'd like to share before we get to this 1954 movie, there's just one more thing about Weima, and this takes place in the 1890s. So again, this is a post-war kind of story. After the war, we go back to Frank and Toby Riddle. They are encouraged by their friend Alfred Meum, who Weima saved, to go on tour, to take the Modoc story on tour and to do a stage presentation complete with native song and tribal dress, and even to the point where Meum decides to join this tour. And it's a very small entourage. It's not a traveling Broadway troupe by any means, and they're shoestringing it across the country, but they do make it to the East Coast. They do put on shows in New York City and other East Coast locations. However, they ran out of funding. They weren't bringing in a whole lot from the audiences, so they had to disband their tour. But again, it was an attempt to try to bring more education, more understanding of the Native plight to people on the East Coast. And we see in the 1870s a combined kind of a sympathy growing for certain natives, particularly on the East Coast where they're not directly dealing with natives for the most part. And we see, of course, the increase in military expenditures, military conflict. Of course, the Little Bighorn shows up pretty soon after this in the mid 1870s. So again, it's a period of much confusion and much conflict regarding Native Americans in our country. But the story continues with Mr. Meum. He is determined, as the 1880s go forward, to secure for his friend Weima a government pension. And amazingly, he is able to succeed in doing so. In 1891, during the Benjamin Harrison administration, thanks to Alfred Meum, Weima is awarded an official government pension of $25 a month, which he collected for 30 years and ends up being one of the only women on government military pension records to be given a pension. So that alone to me is remarkable, and it shows you the full force of the story and what it took for Weima to achieve this goal. Many people, I'm not saying Native women, but I know many soldiers and many folks had very strong allies in their camp trying to secure legitimate pensions, and they were denied quite often during this period. The idea of government pensions and handouts was a foreign notion in 1891. So again, that was a remarkable discovery, which I did not come across the first time I looked at this war or in this period of history. So I think, I'm not saying that's new information or it wasn't available back 20 years ago, but I think it's just being highlighted more because of this the uniqueness of the story and the situation. So now we can go forward to the 1950s and we'll see Hollywood's version of the Modoc War. And this movie is called Drumbeat. It's from the Alan Ladd Studios, so he's the star. And his character, and again, I haven't seen this movie and I might want to check it out because it seems at least somewhat accurate as opposed to a lot of these movies from this period. But Alan Ladd, as far as I can tell, basically becomes the character of Toby and Frank Riddle. He's like the lone wilderness guy who can speak native languages, who becomes the interpreter, who's there at the scene of the assassination of Canby, etc. So I think this was a fairly reasonably accurate representation of what had happened in the Modoc War. And the reason for that, I believe, is that the screenwriter, whose name escapes me right now, grew up in this area. He actually was exposed to these stories as a kid from his grandparents. And again, if this movie shows any sympathy at all towards Native Americans, and by the way, just a little teaser here, Captain Jack was played by Charles Bronson, which to me seems like pretty good casting. I mean, just from what I can tell, I think that alone has me intrigued. I'd like to see how Captain Jack is portrayed by the legendary bad guy Bronson. But again, I think this was a fairly accurate depiction. And I know I would almost certainly guess there was no Native American input into this movie. But again, it seems like it was reasonably accurate. I know it was filmed in Sedona, Arizona, so that really doesn't quite capture the bleakness of some of these lava bed zones. I've been to Sedona, and it's a lot more scenic than the lava beds. But again, to the credit of Hollywood, every once in a while they get something right, and I think this movie might be at least not the worst example of Hollywood butchery towards history. And we're going to just show one more slide right now, and I believe this is the guy that Charles Bronson couldn't wait to play, Captain Jack. And again, I just find him to be, along with Weima, just a sympathetic figure in the sense that, you know, even his expressions in all of his photographs look so melancholy. They don't look mean or mad. He just looks resigned and kind of melancholy. And again, the few quotes that have come out that are directly from him don't really show a lot of vindictiveness or these other things that he's been accused of. But there is no doubt he was the hands-on murderer of General Edward Canby, and that can't be overlooked. And again, it makes this, you know, relatively, you would think, relatively low-key, trying to mind his own business guy. It makes him a war criminal. And again, it's just an unfortunate clash of cultures. It's not really anything new or different in the long litany of these culture clashes. However, the few things that stand out here, I'll conclude with, are the fact that this was the only Native American conflict with the U.S. military in the state of California, which is fascinating in a way because it's not that California didn't have Native Americans. They were plenty populating the state. It seems, though, that because the Spanish influence was so much more prevalent in California towards the Native Americans, in other words, Christianizing attempts, civilization attempts, I think the natives there had already been so exposed to European culture that it wasn't as much of a clash for them when the gold rush came in. There's been talk of that the California natives were just simply more passive, less aggressive. because they had more abundance in their world. I have no evidence of that. I can't speak to that, but it's possible there's something to that. The climate, of course, in the Modoc country, the harsh high desert, which was much less hospitable, meaning that survival was much harder work, which means that maybe, yeah, they were a little more tense and angry and protective of their special hunting zones and their water zones, and to see settlers tromping through their areas, of course, was a difficult development for them. But another side note of this war that should be mentioned is that U.S. military in an 8-month period spent well over $400,000 to trying to defeat the Modocs. That would be the equivalent. I think it's something like $15 million today. The casualty rate was extremely high for the U.S. military. They lost about 1 in 10 men to illness or injury, a far greater number than the natives suffered from. And I believe I saw one report that said that if the U.S. government had simply spent $20,000 on a separate reservation, whether it was land that was available south of the Klamath Reservation, so it could be somewhat consolidated, or whether it was the lava beds themselves, which were not really for sale. I don't think anyone owned the lava beds at that time. They were simply public land or public domain, meaning that it wasn't meant to be homesteaded. Any amount of expenditure towards a separate reservation would have solved this entire problem and would have led to no Modoc War. So again, we look at poor decisions and inflexible bureaucracies, and we look at, again, culture clash, the inevitable culture clash. But again, it's hard not to feel some sympathy for this guy we're looking at here. Ever since I first visited the lava beds, you had to kind of feel for the guy a little bit and his clan, because of I mean, when you put yourself into someone's shoes who's been through what Captain Jack and his family have been through, it's a different perspective. If you've never been there, it's easy to overlook maybe what he's going through. But if you can put yourself there, it's a little easier to understand the vigor in which the Modoc protested the actions of the government. So that does conclude today's Zoom chat. And again, I am more than happy to listen and to sit through any questions or comments. We have other photos here Michelle has posted. This is good too, because the center photograph is the one I mentioned at the very beginning. That was one of the staged photographs from Mr. Muybridge. This was actually a Warm Springs tribesman, and the Warm Springs tribe was an enemy of the Modoc. So to depict the Modoc War, Muybridge chose an enemy warrior to pose as a Modoc. This did offend the Modoc when they realized, years later, when they were going through historical archives, they were quick to point out, this is not one of us. This is one of our enemies pretending to be one of us. We don't like this. So this is an example of what Muybridge was doing. But again, you see the military tents off on the right. They were all based, like I said, on native design. These are all basic military style teepees, and they were named Sibley tents after a general who ended up siding with the Confederacy in the Civil War and was defeated by none other than General Canby in the Battle of Glorieta Pass in New Mexico, a little known venue for Civil War activity. But again, you can just see the stark ruggedness, the completely desolate landscape. But underground, everything was cool. Everything was temperature controlled and unblastable, and it worked for 8 months, holding off the U.S. government. They say also, I mentioned the expenditure of over $400,000. This was the most expensive war per capita in U.S. history until the Vietnam War. So I thought that was also significant too. There we have some resources for folks who are interested. Go ahead.
I just wanted to include this because it really is a fascinating story that many of us didn't know anything about. So there's a couple of really good documentaries, and the drumbeat, unfortunately, the Charles Bronson, that you'd have to watch that. You have to pay to watch that unless you can catch it on Turner Classic Movies. That's hit or miss, but that's like a $3.99 rental on Amazon Prime or Apple TV. But the Modoc War, the Oregon Experience that you mentioned, Chuck, to me, that full documentary, it's about an hour or so. That's available on YouTube. I included the link there, and that you wouldn't be able to type that in, but I could, if anybody's interested, I can send that to the people that attended today. And then the other one is the documentary, The Modoc War, An Untold Story of Survival. That's still playing at film festivals, but it's also available for free, it looks like, the entire movie on that website. So you put in modocfilm.com, and that looks like a really good recent documentary. Not that the Oregon Experience, that's, Oregon Public Broadcasting, not that that's not good. I'm sure it's similar in some way, but I think the 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 latter one is probably more from, I think, a lot of Native American interviews and surviving people, people that have survived, family members. So anyway, if you want,
Chihuahua James has a lot to do with that. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, for more information,
I was going to say,
check out one of those films. And
I was going to say
go ahead, Chuck.
I was going to say, Chihuahua James, I mentioned, the great granddaughter of Shak Nasty Jim, I know is heavily responsible for that most recent 2021 documentary. So again, she is, again, I call her like the living link to the Modoc War. And I haven't seen that. I do plan on watching that, but I have seen the Oregon Experience documentary, and it's very well done. They generally do a very good job. It's fairly balanced, and it's showing, the both sides of the story pretty thoroughly. So I do recommend that one thoroughly. Yes. And by the way, I just found the correct name for the Modoc language. In their words, Lutuami, Lutuami. So the lava bed name Katai Tala, that's Lutuami for lava beds. Wanted to make sure I got that in.
And I'm going to start off with the questions. Have you been to the lava beds?
Yes, I've been there 3 times, possibly a 4th time, and I can't remember exactly, but it's one of my favorite places to visit. It's been a while now. It's time to go back. Beautiful campground.
Really, what's so interesting about it? Like the very terrain?
Well, it's just the terrain is honestly, the terrain would be a lot less interesting if a war didn't happen there, because I'm not really a caver. I'm not a spelunker. I have nothing against caves, but I don't seek them out. This just happens to be a complete cave network that's part of U.S. history. That's part of military history. So to me, that was just fascinating by itself. To read the stories, and it's really well done on the site with markers and side stories. But again, to be there and to realize that 50 armed men held off 1,000 military personnel is just remarkable. And then when you see the caves, you understood how they did it. That's how difficult and impregnable this area really is to this day. It would still be a very, very solid stronghold, outside of nuclear weapons, I suppose. But it's a very unique, even amongst lava beds and even amongst, all the lava that we come across in Oregon and California. It's unique even to that because of the caves that formed underneath. There's actually one cave that has been off limits, and I don't know if they've changed that supposedly has artifacts intact, and they let people, archaeologists are allowed in there once or twice a year to document but it's a guarded cave with, there's a cage around it basically, so it's fully protected. But again, they're still learning from what they're pulling out of the cave in that section. So fascinating stuff.
Interesting. There's a chance I might lose you for some reason. My computer is saying it's low battery, although it's plugged in, which is kind of scary. So it may be that my whole computer is just dying on me. So I'm gonna make you the host just in case, and that way you guys can continue the
Okay.
discussion without me, and then I'm gonna hop on my other computer.
Okay.
So just ask your questions, unmute yourself and ask away.
Well, I have a kind of a comment. I just heard or read very recently that there's possibly an active volcano right off the coast there, which, maybe we should go to the lava bed soon in case they don't exist in the near future.
Yes, that is true. The entire Cascade Range, which is not far off from the lava bed location, it's a little bit east of the lava beds. That isn't considered an active volcanic mountain range. Of course, everyone remembers Mount St. Helens in Washington, which is part of that same range. Off the coast, though, I'm not as familiar with volcanic activity, but I do know there's a major earthquake fault line that runs right off the coast near where I live.
Oh, you're right.
And
I'm sorry. Yeah, that
yes,
was it.
And it's not an active fault zone, but it has been active in the past. And when it's been active, it's been massively active. So the last earthquake documented in that area is from September of the year 1700. And the reason they know this is beyond geology. They actually have a written record from Japan, which recorded a tsunami that correlates to the geological record in Oregon. So they can pinpoint to the day when this earthquake happened. And it was probably a 9+ earthquake. So we're talking about 100-foot drops in cliffs, major tsunamis. It totally changed the Oregon coastline to a point we'd never even realized, because it's so long ago that everything's kind of settled back into place. But they're saying it seems to be, possibly due because, these rifts do rip, on a pretty regular basis. So we're a little overdue actually for one out there, but it's not something you can really put in the top of your mind and focus on, because then you really couldn't do very much. You'd be in a continual panic. Every little truck that went by, you think it's the next big one. So we try not to think about it too much, but we want to make sure people know about it, because I think a lot of wealthy people buying up our real estate are not told this by local realtors, because of course that might change their opinion. They think they're moving out of California to a safe earthquake-free zone. Well, maybe, but maybe not.
There are no safe places, really.
No, I agree. Pick your poison, you might want to say.
Yeah, I'm staying here in Jersey.
I'd like to make a comment. When I was looking at the map where the lava beds were, it's actually near Tule Lake. And Tule Lake was the internment camp that we put the Japanese in, who were what they considered incorrigible or wouldn't fight for the United States. They were sent to Tule Lake because it was isolated and rugged. And it was hard to escape from. So that whole area needs to be full of history. Good, bad.
Yes, in fact, Tule Lake is one of about, I think, 8 of the concentration camps used, or internment camps is what they were referred to officially.
Yeah, I call them concentration camps because that's what they really were. But that was the one.
The guns were pointed in, right? The guns were pointed in, not out. So yes, they were concentration camps. However, one little tidbit of history that mostly goes unknown is that even closer to the lava beds than Tule Lake, which is not far, you're right, there's a closer location that is actually the site of one of the only German prisoner of war camps or internment camps in our country. There may have been one on the East Coast. I know there was something in Texas.
There was
and
one
then
in
there
Texas.
was this one.
Yes,
there was one in Texas. It was for German Americans. These weren't prisoners of war. These were German Americans who were considered suspects, and it wasn't a big number. The Japanese far outnumbered the German Americans in these internment camps, but there were several hundred and total prisoners. And I know one of them was right next to the lava beds. in a very remote part, of course, of that area. So yeah, the first time I went there, I saw a little sign that talked about it, and I was pretty shocked. I had never heard of a internment camp. I believe there was also one for Italian Americans too, but very small and only for the most radical of the radicals.
Right. I think Texas had a lot of soldiers that were POWs that went to Texas also, because they worked on the farmlands in Texas. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the Tule Lake one was where they sent all the ones who would not agree to fight for America, or who were suing the United States for their freedom. Yeah. And so those were considered troublemakers. And so they sent them this most isolated, rugged area they could find, which was Tule Lake. Which I've never been there, but I want to go.
It's an interesting location. It's very harsh and rugged. I know they grow a lot of horseradish in the Tule Lake Valley, and they have a factory. And Tule Lake horseradish is well known throughout Oregon and California. So it's good environment for something, at least growing wise. And again, still lightly populated, mostly ranch land today. So you'll see huge ranches with irrigation systems. And that's been a big part of the controversy there lately is water rights. There's been, of course, the natives are involved in these discussions too, as far as salmon health goes, but farmers versus natives, that's been a long-standing water dispute in that area. And it continues to this day, whether they dam it, whether they take the dam out, there's always a discussion about who gets the water and how much. And water is scarce there. It's some years it's real scarce. So farming doesn't go too well there without irrigation. It's not a good area for dryland farming. So they need the irrigation. And that's the big fight today is water.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else to comment on?
You know, from the perspective of the Europeans, of the whites who came to this country, they were actually very lucky that the Native Americans, that they basically were so few in number, and that they were so broken up in terms of tribes and not able to fight together, because their fighting abilities were magnificent. They were outstanding warriors. But there were so few of them, per se, considering the size of the European influx that was coming in. And they more often than not fought among themselves. They were not able to gather themselves together to try to resist the whites as they were coming in. And even from a perspective, not just of the different tribes, from a perspective of, say, a village, they were hyper individualistic in terms of their way of thinking. They did not have the ability, the organizational ability to wage prolonged wars. I mean, every person was his own boss. And it wasn't like, you know, we want you to get together and serve for 2 years fighting in a military unit. That was unthinkable to them. They're always represented in the cottage industry of the time. The movies and the books and such represented, you know, if you see a film, it's like a stagecoach being attacked by 50 warriors, and 20 of them are shot dead. They weren't idiots. They weren't lunatics. I mean, they knew how to fight, as we see in something like the Modoc Wars. As we see, Geronimo with 16 men went on fighting for years, and they could do nothing with him. He was just moving through the caverns. They couldn't do anything with him. The Nez Perce under Chief Joseph, they were extraordinary, but they simply did not have the numbers and the organizational ability to resist, because if they had, they would have driven us right back into the Atlantic.
I agree. And also with numbers, remember too that the natives were losing far more to disease than they were to military engagement. So their numbers, as much as they could be breeding, it didn't matter, because the disease was starting to level off any increase in population. So you had at best you had a steady population, if not a decrease. So that goes against the increasing flood of white settlers. And that's part of the problem too. It was a numbers game. And the other part obviously would be technological, because it's really hard to fight howitzers with bows and arrows. And that became a bit of the problem too. With the protection of the lava beds, the natives can get away with the single shot rifles. And then when it came to warfare outside of the caves, they were going to be outmatched and would really have to utilize their wits to survive. And again, the idea of I mean, the other example I maybe have mentioned in a previous Zoom chat during the War of 1812 was Tecumseh. And it's one of the only examples of a native who tried to organize multiple tribes into one force. And it didn't go well, as Tom was just saying. I mean, not only did we see in what we just talked about, the Modoc War, not only did we see Modocs and Klamath feuding from the get-go, they had originally, of course, been connected. They have ancestral connection there. And yet the feud, which goes back so far that no one knew how far, I mean, it was just a long-standing enemy. We saw that, but also within the Modocs themselves, we see the split between Captain Jack and Hooker Jim, which again leads to chaos. It leads to dissension. It leads to people taking sides. So you had a group of 50 warriors that couldn't even keep their own 50 together. So it's a good example, Tom, of, just the lack of cohesion and how that hampered their efforts, for sure.
I heard a very instructional story once that several important Indian chiefs were brought out east. They wanted to negotiate with them, but they also wanted to scare them as well. They wanted to show them the power of the white man. So they brought them, it was roughly to Sandy Hook, and they had a huge naval emplacement there. They had a huge naval gun pointing out to the ocean. And they thought that the natives are going to be terrified by this. They fired this huge gun. It shot a ball about 2 miles. And they looked to the natives to see how terrified they were. And they were laughing. They were laughing their asses off at this. Because they were saying, what are you going to do with this? You mean to tell us you're going to drag this thing across the country? Even the most feeble of our elderly would be able to run circles around this thing. So feeling terrible, they had failed in their mission. The military guys sent the natives back. But they sent them through New York City, and they succeeded in their stated purpose of terrorizing them because they drove them through the middle of Midtown Manhattan. And these are people for whom, with the Modocs, like 200 people, these are people for whom 200 individuals in a tribe were a lot of folks. They're watching hundreds, and then thousands, and then tens of thousands of whites milling around. And they're like, oh my God, they were used to seeing the settlements on the frontier. They're like, how many of these people are there? How could they fit so many of them together in one place? How could they feed them? Because that was one of the things that limited the size of native tribes as well, is that they didn't have the ability, many of them, they lived by hunting for buffalo and such. It limited how many, you couldn't have 12 kids because you'd have to feed 12 kids by hunting massive amounts of food and growing massive amounts of food. But it terrified them when they realized the numbers. Something like the Little Bighorn, they had maybe 3,000, 2,000, 3,000 warriors in one spot at once, which was a gigantic number to them. They couldn't imagine something like Gettysburg, where 160,000 men fought for 3 days and 50,000 plus were casualties. These numbers were just unimaginable to them. They couldn't fathom.
Yes, very good point. And going to your original part of that discussion about the trying to impress them with the big guns off of Sandy Hook, fear and intimidation always played a role here. And even in the Modoc War, we see the plans of the execution, the plans of the military tribunal. It was announced in the San Francisco Chronicle that the execution is to be as public as possible so that they may forever be terrified by the spectacle. So another example of how absolutely fear and intimidation was a big part of the story. But I do believe after the event you're talking about, it might not have been the first time that Native leaders were exposed to large city numbers, meaning, like you say, populations beyond their imagination. I think the more and more leaders that got glimpses of the numbers were going back west saying, we've got no chance. Let's just do what we can because there's too many of them. They didn't know how many of them there were when they're meeting small groups. And another side note, too, that I came across doing the research, which I found interesting, is that Native Americans, and this is not unknown, but Native Americans commonly, especially during this period, refer to all white people as Bostons, which, as someone from the New York area, I find kind of funny. But there's a reason, of course, because Boston goes back to its origins as an enclave, a religious enclave that was extremely Puritan and white and European, whereas New York was always cosmopolitan. New York was never going to be homogenous and one group of people. So right from the get-go, there's your difference between Boston and New York. You can actually refer to white people as Bostons, and people understood what that meant. In fact, natives would name their own people Boston. We have Modoc here. We came across Boston Charlie, who was part of the execution group, one of the four killed. He was a lighter skinned Modoc, and to signify him, he was Boston Charlie, which I just found kind of humorous.
It's kind of sardonically hilarious too that they were shipping them all out to Oklahoma because they figured nobody wanted the land. And then, as you know, from as presented in Killers of the Flower Moon, that when they settled the Osage out there, and suddenly they found that they'd settled them on land that had oil that was valuable. Then they set about trying to get them off the land and kill them so they could reclaim the land. It's like, hell, if we knew there was anything of value there, we wouldn't have settled you there in the first place.
Hey, you want to go back to Oregon? All expenses paid. Yeah,
exactly.
There's no coincidence why they were willing to do that. Yeah. And only 30 took the offer. So that meant that some Modocs stayed behind. And I do believe some got rich in the oil business. I'm fairly certain of that, speculating and, off reservation stuff, but they were in the right place at the right time.
They better have a good insurance policy, life insurance policy, just in case, if they wanted to stay. One of the funny things about especially the Western tribes, they despised the Europeans, the whites coming in, because they were people who prized warrior abilities and prized survival abilities. And when they observed the cavalry and the militias out there, they thought, how are we being forced off our land by these people? They can't shoot, they can't ride, they have no survival skills out if they're left off in the plains or such. They can't fight hand to hand. How the hell is it? That's why in many cases when they would defeat them, they would cut them up because they really despised them. Whereas on the flip side of that, when they faced off against mountain men and such and killed them, they very often prepared their bodies because they respected a warrior. If you're familiar with the Fetterman massacre, at that battle,
yes, I am.
They ripped their bodies to pieces. But there was a fellow named Metzger who was the bugler, and his body was the only one that wasn't decimated. He was wrapped in a buffalo robe, and his body was carefully prepared. But he had his bugle next to him, and it had been crushed to the point that you couldn't even tell what it was. He apparently had used it like a hammer, and it had beaten in a lot of Sioux heads in the process. And they respected that. They respected the warrior ethos, and they were just annoyed, no end, the idea these people aren't particularly capable, but how is it that we can't fight them? How is it we can't deal with them throwing us off their land? But they had organizational abilities, and they had numbers that they just could not compete with. They could not deal with. When they wanted at the Little Bighorn, they thought, well, we just killed 250 of these people. We won't have to worry about them again. And the next week, it's like they're still after us. What the hell is the matter with this?
That was the theory behind going after General Canby amongst the Warhawks of the Modocs. They actually thought Sconchan John was mainly responsible for this school of thought. Sconchan and his cohorts thought that by killing the general, everyone else will go away. There's a naivety there based in probably what you're saying is not realizing the numbers are so overwhelming because they just simply replaced them with another general. They had 100 more generals they can throw in the mix if you killed the 99 first one. So again, it was a never-ending stream of military power. And also the other really big factor in this story and all of these stories is the vengeance factor. And there's one little side note story I'd like to share. And this happens during the period, I want to say August, September of 1873. So this is after the perpetrators from the Modocs were brought to the Klamath Reservation. They are held under guard. There was one attempted escape. They tried to cut through their chains and were caught. But they weren't treated all that harshly. They were fed and they were interviewed many, many times. And one story that came out from that period I found interesting. they brought in the survivors of the Hooker Jim massacre. And this is the one I mentioned, that he killed 16 settlers, all men, on his way back to the lava beds when the war first began in November of 1872. And so they brought the survivors, not all of them, but several women and kids came. And they basically, the purpose of the military bringing these women in was to identify the perpetrator of the massacre. And Hooker Jim was a very distinctive figure, it seems, and would be easily identified. But he was already protected by his clemency for bringing in Captain Jack, or leading the military to Captain Jack. So I'm not sure if he was ever shown to the women. They might have been showing other natives who were also there but not protected. And so what happened is, immediately two of the women start attacking the native men they had a gun, they had a knife, they started stabbing. Like, these women were so angry, two of them had to be pulled away and subdued to allow the questioning to continue by other women who weren't resorting to such violence. So I thought, even in a moment of like supposed calm and information gathering, the vengeance factor was so strong in this story. And again, we see that with Hooker Jim's actions. We see that somewhat with Captain Jack, but he seemed to have less of the vengeance bug than a lot of his cohorts, again, because his own father was killed 20 years prior. And if there's not a vengeance building there, then there never would be. But I think Captain Jack seemed to see a bigger picture and was a little more maybe resigned than some of his compatriots to the fate of what ultimately happened. And again, I know at least one of the warriors committed suicide rather than facing the tribunal. So that was his choice to exit. But again, the vengeance is every armed conflict of this story is tit for tat, and it's like chicken egg. What came first, the tit or the tat? There's no really origin story to prove that. So basically, it's warranted vengeance all over the place, which really gets ugly really quick.
And it's what we've presented. It's interesting you point out, like, film Drumbeat, because slowly over time, film began to turn around with films like that. With Cheyenne Autumn, that was John Ford's way of trying to show a different side of that conflict. Broken Arrow, trying to show films that represented that maybe the Indians, the Native Americans, were not the bloodthirsty savages that they were presented to be. Maybe there was a point of view that should be perspective. And that perspective finally came to fruition in the late 60s when they came up with the revisionist Westerns. You saw things like Little Big Man, with Custer being a lunatic who has a mental breakdown in the middle of the Battle of the Big Man. But, oh yeah, it's tremendous. Just following that whole film all the way through, it's like amazing. But it's the colonizer's playbook. You present the colonizers as the victims, and you present the colonized as the aggressors. You flip the whole thing around. And for decades, and we destroyed their culture, we destroyed their religions, we destroyed their. My understanding was that they weren't even allowed to sing certain of their songs until like the 1970s. There was like a cap on the ability of Native Americans to even sing their songs. It's just like amazing. And then we had the Christian schools developed so as to pull them completely away from their cultural base and just re-educate them and make them as a new age European.
It's really all about a complete lack of respect, as far as I can tell. It's that ethnic superiority thing that really doesn't allow people to see other people as having equally valid different ways of going about business. And again, when it comes to natural resources, capitalism doesn't look at things the way the natives did. The natives were about regeneration. The natives would burn to have regeneration, and the whites would come in and burn to clear land to plant, to take out the forest permanently. And so the motives were way different. And again, survival versus accumulation type production, again, way different focus on just lifestyle and such. So I'm really pleased that the 150th anniversary of this war, which was last year, has brought about this new age. You mentioned the 1960s. Now we have a new wave of Native pride that is trying to, tell the full story, and that's really all this is. It's not about revisionist history. That's a word that it's a label that bugs the crap out of me. And I used to get into this debate with my late beloved Aunt Marion quite a bit, because she would, she had a sense of history. She wasn't ignorant and in the dark, but she also had her biases and prejudices that were very strong. And she always warned me about these revisionist historians who were changing the playbook, and they were changing the real history. And I would have to remind her all the time, number one, that the original histories were written by the winners, so they have a bias that's embedded into them. And history is always going to be revisable as long as things come out that shed new light on old stories. This is happening every day in archaeology. It's happening every day in geology. We're learning more and more about the planet, about humans, about animals, about all these things, and it adds to our body of knowledge. So revising, revising itself shouldn't be a bad thing. It's just the way it's used. It's like the term conspiracy now. It's become abused to the point of it's lost its meaning. So I do tend to pipe up when I hear fears of revisionist history, because all history it's revising the story that came with new information, with suppressed information, with diaries that were just found. I remember years ago watching a C-SPAN where they opened a chest of Woodrow Wilson's doctor, and it proved a lot of points that people were saying for 100 years about Woodrow Wilson. But I'm like one of the few people that care about those things, and I get that it's not a common interest for most people, but still we have to remember that it's living. History's alive. And the 2021 documentary about the Modocs celebrates their culture, and again reminds us that history's alive. There's tidbits in all of these stories that I like to look for, that even if it's not a new diary that was just found, it's still a tidbit that had been buried for a long time that needs to be exposed and discovered to tell the whole story. And again, trying not to take sides too much, trying to just tell as it happened with new information. But it's hard not to take sides when you come across a guy like Captain Benjamin Wright, who I heard about that guy when I first moved to Oregon. He's still kind of legendary, and not necessarily in a bad way to a lot of the descendants of the white settlers. I mean, he's still like a legend in a good way to them, that he took out a lot of Indians because it gave their families the ranches that they enjoy today. So again, the history is alive in that way for people. Benjamin Wright is still a hero to people. And when you do the research, you realize it's hard to imagine him as a hero taking out people who weren't involved in warfare, taking out innocent civilians. So there is that element of it depends on what you want to focus on. I wanted to focus on the things I talked about today because I think it's it's an overview and it's trying to present both sides of the story. But when I came across John Luttrell's quotes, I was shocked. Again, the least surprising thing was he didn't get reelected. The most surprising thing is that he had the balls to actually put this on paper and send it to a cabinet member. And made sure it was published in the paper too. It wasn't meant for private eyes. He wanted people to know where he stood. And at the same time, he wasn't assassinated. He was allowed to go back to his regular life after politics. But again, to have the guts to stand up, to make a case that's, this was started by bad white men. Here's a white man saying that. I think that's significant. Looking back in history, we didn't get a whole lot of that at the time, but it's good to remember some of these folks.
They say it's you're doing the wrong thing because you're revising history. But when history, so much of it is basically myths and propaganda, then what you're doing is you're actually uncovering the real history. You're actually pushing aside the bullshit per se to see what really happened. Like something like, well, the Spanish blew up the Maine. Of course the Spanish didn't blow up the Maine. The Spanish didn't want a war that they knew they couldn't possibly win. The question in my mind is whether we blew up the Maine or not, or whether it was just an accident. But, You know, we have that propaganda that goes on and on and on and on for years. And now people are beginning to see
and again,
it for real.
We're looking too at the 1870s. It's kind of the beginning of the modern propaganda era, with the newspapers and the magazines being so prominent. It's interesting to see how businessmen, these newspaper owners, thought it was worth their effort. They saw public interest rise as they kept printing these pictures in newspapers, and they kept getting letters to the editor. There was a whole lot of interest in this at the time. And again, the way we think in this country, how can I make some money on this? And the way they did is by, using modern technology. The photography, again, I can't say enough about the photography and about the efforts it took to have Muybridge go out there and do what he did. There was one other gentleman who was his assistant who took over after Muybridge left. But I mean, hard to imagine the difficulties they went through. Forget about the war itself. If they were going out on a nature survey to take photographs, it would be just about as difficult as during warfare. So again, this is like exploited. This is a war that was exploited for public purposes, for money-making purposes in a way. And I think that exploitation we see on both sides. We see until the Canby assassination, the Modocs are getting praised in the press. They're being raised up to some level that maybe they don't even deserve because of the way the romanticism framed it at the time. And that was shattered immediately after the Canby assassination, except in Georgia, where they were really happy.
And they'd probably still be happy today. They're still holding on to that.
Possibly.
You see, because they're trying to rename the schools again. It's like, call it
it's not over yet.
Yeah,
I know you think it ended in 1865. It hasn't ended yet. No, it hasn't.
I also learned two important things here today as well, that if you want to become a genius, that you should have your head banged around in a carriage accident, and that if you want to get along over your in-laws, make sure to gift them a couple of horses.
Very, very, very good lessons. The Muybridge thing, I personally, I can't personally attest to head injuries increasing intelligence, but I certainly have experienced that with people, and turning points in their life happen to be a serious accident. For example, Michelle and my dad had a serious accident as a teenager, swimming in Lake Michigan, and it was a major head injury, and he's probably been a genius ever since. So I mean, again, we've seen some evidence of this firsthand, but again, Muybridge deserves his own hour for sure. A fascinating story. He basically is responsible for the origin of motion picture. A lot of his work was in stereography, which was basically stereoscoping, meaning he was taking two photos and you're looking at each photo with each eye, and so that would create this 3D image. He had action photos where he was trying to basically photograph a horse in motion for his patron, Leland Stanford. Leland Stanford hired him to capture a horse in motion, and he did it by setting up guy wires along a track, and the horse would trip the wire, set off the photograph, and they put together the string of photographs, and they showed the horse in action, basically stop action, flip card technology, 1880 or so. So it was very, very early on. But again, Muybridge was motivated. He was an inventor. A lot of his inventions helped facilitate future photographic advances. So someone who, is, again, worthy of his own special, for sure.
I've always
just
seen
the name Ead Weird, yeah.
I've always seen that horse riding along, that early version of a horse riding along is one of the first times that we had something in motion. So that was Muybridge, actually.
That was Muybridge. That was Muybridge, yes. And they were, one of the points they were trying to prove was, does a horse leave the ground when it's in full run, when it's in full trot? Are all four hooves off the ground at one time? Because it never was shown to be the case before, because the human eye and photography couldn't handle that at the time. But this was proven now through this, slowly advancing technology, that indeed there are moments when the horse is almost flying because none of its hooves are on the ground.
I think we discussed this once before, but native treaties, they have native treaties which were supposed to be honored. They were never honored, but they were never technically gotten rid of as well. And we've always had a contiguous U.S. government. We haven't had the collapse of our government, so the argument couldn't be made and new government came in. Would there be any for the descendants of some of these tribes? Would there be any ability for them to state, listen, there were treaties that we had that were supposed to give us this land or give us these rights or that rights? Is it just something that's lost in history, or could they dust some of those things off and say, you never threw these out, you never specifically stated they're no longer to be withheld, to be upheld or such? I was wondering if there was anything that could be dusted off on that.
I believe that has been done from time to time. I can think of two examples offhand. I know the Sioux tribe got really litigious about 30 years ago, and they were using original treaties during their proceedings. So, again, they had to go and get law degrees. They had to go and spend time with the original documents. So it took time and effort, but I think it succeeded in that they got either extra settlement money or whatever out of the government based on the results of trials using the original treaty language. So I know it's been done successfully. Another example was out in Washington State. This goes back several decades, but it was about a fisheries case. And again, the tribe was able to incorporate enough of the still valid language of the original treaty to restore or sustain, I can't remember which, fishing rights on the Columbia River. That was a big story. I think that goes back to the 1960s or 70s. So yes, there are examples, but I think it's pretty specific to the treaty and the tribe. So it may depend simply on how the treaty was worded, but as far as validity goes, your points are well taken in that the treaties aren't abrogated unless agreed to by both parties or one of the nations no longer exists. So technically, yes, they can and have used their original treaty rights to gain benefits in today's society, but I can't be more specific than that.
One of the things that's so great about your presentations is that you come up with things that you put on here that are off the beaten path. It's not the obvious stuff. Even something like the story of the Nez Perce would be the more obvious thing to go with. But you go with the Modoc Wars, I'd heard of but never actually studied them. So much of what you put here, and I'm reasonably conversant in history, but it's all stuff that really is just to the side, just off the beaten path. And it's all pretty much new to me, and it's excellent to be able to listen to you and have you go over things which give us a broader understanding of what's been taking place in this.
I do greatly appreciate that, Tom. That's a very nice compliment because that's pretty close to what I'm aiming for. I've always been very, very interested and focused on what no one else focuses on, which is one of the reasons I never saw the Star Wars movies as a kid and still haven't, because again, anything that got that popular was probably not for me. That's kind of what I would just go with as a general rule. So, for example, my favorite football team here growing up in New Jersey wasn't the Jets or the Giants because that's too obvious, or even the Eagles or the Cowboys. No, I was a Denver Bronco fan, mainly because nobody else I knew was. So going to the obscure is just a natural thing for me, but it's nice to be recognized for that sometimes, because most people, they look confused when you start talking about strange things. I've never heard of that. Are you making this up? I don't know about this. So again, it's nice to be, at least recognized for the purposes of just general, kind of appreciation that yes, it's very intentional. I'm very excited by the uncovering of the existing and shedding new light on old things. And again, it's all new to me. I've studied the Modoc War for 20 years now, and I still come across so much new information. So this was an old topic for me. I was really getting into it when I first got out to Oregon and visited the lava beds, but revisiting is even more fun because I can just build on my existing data bank and then add all of these kind of new and interesting tidbits. And so it's been a lot of fun. I always enjoyed doing these presentations, and this one was a little bit extra fun, I have to say.
You uncovered diamonds in the rough.
Yes, yes.
What's your next presentation?
The next presentation is, I don't have an exact date, but it's late July. So we'll look at one of those last Mondays in July. It's going to be a biographical sketch of a person I'm calling the first modern influencer. And his name was Edward Bernays. He's basically the first publicist of modern stylings that we have in this country. He's the nephew, actually he's the double nephew of Sigmund Freud. So we do have a very strong Freudian thing going on there. And what I was most amazed about doing my preliminary research is how many different areas of advertising he became involved in. He convinced women to smoke cigarettes. He did work for the military. He did work for the nukes. I mean, across the board, this guy covered every angle with the ability to convince you that you needed something that you didn't really need. So again, I find this very, very relevant today. I think we're covered in Bernays type activities these days, but it starts somewhere. The modern version of this starts somewhere. I mean, maybe back in old Greece, they were tricking people into buying things they didn't want or trading for things they didn't want, but this is truly a modern version of it. And it's fascinating. And he lived to be 103 or something like that too. So there's a long history. There's many, many famous connections. So it'll be fun. And this is one that's going to be a little bit new to me. So I'm looking forward to it. And we just have an update from Jeff. It's on the 29th. So we get to learn about Mr. Bernays.
It's the 29th at 2:30. We have to unfortunately squeeze it in there. And I know that some people will be upset because we have a book club that day at 3:30, but so book club people will either be late for their book club or you know, you'll have to keep it within an hour. It's okay if you go over an hour, but in any case, we're going to start it at 2:30, and
Okay.
that'll be really interesting. Did you plug yet your evergreens?
No, I haven't. I mean, what I'm doing is, as we're preparing for September, and Michelle can clue you in a little bit more on that, I'll have a more a weekly presence, I believe, and so right now I'm basically making a list of topics that we can explore at that time.
Right.
So anything that pops in my head, I'm just writing it down.
Okay.
And
so
maybe,
Chuck, maybe we can set up a an email or something where people have ideas. Like, so I'm just to give people a clue that are still on. Chuck is going to do a he'll continue the history profiles, you know, in the month of in this vein, but we may go back to presidents, or we may go back to earlier presidents that we missed, but we're going to try to do something, a weekly program, like a not current events, but not I don't know, something a little more interesting than current events, but maybe more discussion based, but with a topic, and less, you know, not less like researchy, but like maybe a shorter presentation than with a lot of discussion. That's, you know, topical,
Yeah.
you know, like, you know,
Yep.
funny stories in local government, and then people can share a story just off the top of my head. Absurd thing. But anyway, we're just bouncing some ideas around, having fun. Anyway, thanks again. This was great, and great questions. And once again, always a great job, Chuck. We really appreciate it.
Yes, we're going to need comic relief.
We appreciate it a lot.
We're going to need comic relief in the fall.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah, we will. I'm all about that. I'm all about that. I totally understand the need for that. So I will be on the ball with that for sure. Lots of fun.
The impending horror show in November.
Yeah.
Yes. We're going to counteract that with so much fun. You're going to forget about that until, of course, the Zoom chat ends, and then you're going to be back.
Exactly.
With that. We'll have little islands of fluffy fun.
Yeah, we're gonna bill it as like an anecdote to your traditional and non-traditional news.
The antidote to modern society. Yes.
A suicide for
looking forward to it.
Oh my God.
Looking forward to it.
Hey, just on a side note, Chuck, a personal side note. Do you need me to come over and help with the air conditioner?
Oh, gee.
Gonna get hot.
No, we're okay right now. Yeah, we're okay.
Keep saying that. I'll stop.
No. You can stop by. I don't want it in right now. We'll do it tomorrow.
Okay.
I mean, Dad can do it. He can really do it.
I don't want him picking it up. Anyway, we'll talk about this later offline. Anyway, thanks everybody.
I'm not.
Thank you.
I'm not profusely.